For over 20 years now, Metacritic has been filling the internet with its aggregated scores of films, TV shows, music albums, and most importantly to us, video games. It's become so influential now that it's even used by stock market traders to predict changes in gaming company stock prices, and business analysts even use it as a way to predict future sales patterns of games about to be released. For many gamers, Metacritic can often be a port of call to help them with their gaming decisions, and rightly so. But there has been criticism of the way that the website's algorithm works out these scores, and its ability to be manipulated by third-party companies to influence scores. Love it or loathe it, Metacritic is clearly here to stay. But for today's episode, let's take a look at the top 10 Metacritic Nintendo 64 games by ranking. And trust me, there's some truly shocking entries in this list that you don't want to miss. And as always, if you want a full review of any of the games in this list, head on down to the comment section where I'll link you up to my opinions on them, and as always let me know your top Nintendo 64 games in the comments, and who knows, you could help a fellow N64 fan find their next favourite game to play. The first WTF moment on this list in my opinion is absolutely baffling. Now don't get me wrong, Mario Tennis is a damn fun tennis game to play, either alone or with up to 3 friends. But Mario Tennis in the top 10 Nintendo 64 games of all time is surely one of those moments where you start to wonder about Metacritic. Developed by Camelot Software Publishing and released by Nintendo worldwide in the year 2000, Mario Tennis is the first Mario-based tennis game since Mario's Tennis on the Virtual Boy console. Thankfully this one is much more fun to play as you pick either Mario or one of the other usual suspects from the Mushroom Kingdom and battle it out on the court in this pick up and play title. The game is perhaps best known for the introduction of Luigi's arch nemesis Waluigi, an all-around Nintendo legend. But the range of different characters with varying abilities meant that this title had a lot more depth than you may have expected. Fans as a whole loved the ease at which even newcomers to the game could pick up and play and enjoy it. That was often the case of the Nintendo magic, which was apparent in most of their titles such as Mario Kart and even Mario Golf. As a whole, the game did receive huge scores from the gaming press, and it even finished up as the runner-up for the Nintendo 64 Game of the Year, only missing out to Perfect Dark in the top award. The game has nice visuals, although Camelot didn't quite have the same skills as an in-house made Nintendo game, and so some of the character models are a little unique to say the least, and they do lack that Nintendo polish you may expect. But as a whole it's a great sports title, has tons of fun to be had playing with friends, and the controls make this one a must play on the console. And so yes, it is a great game, but when you see what games don't make this Metacritic top 10 list, you'll be foaming at the mouth with rage. Mario Tennis sold over 200,000 copies in its first few weeks, and also landed a Metacritic score of 91 out of a possible 100 at the time of this video. Conkers Bad Fur Day is rightly in this top 10 list, but I was somewhat surprised not to see it higher up. Landing in 9th spot with a Metacritic score of 92, the game was developed and published by Rare in the year 2001. Even before the game was released, it caused quite a stir in the press, and for the first time ever, Nintendo Europe declined to publish the game in the region, leaving THQ to pick up the publishing efforts. Marketing of the game was outsourced to Starcom, who won awards for the game's marketing, targeting what they referred to as a frat boy crowd with adverts in bars, nightclubs and adult magazines. The Conkers Bad Fur Day received over 300,000 unique visitors to the website within the first month of its release, and even the official UK Nintendo 64 magazine boycotted much of the game's pre-release material after the game went from being a kid-friendly platform title into the M-rated masterpiece it went on to become. As Eric Bischoff's biography is titled "Controversy Creates Cash," you would assume that after all of this marketing and media attention, the game would have sold like hotcakes and made mountains of money for Rare. But that's not to be the case, because the game only sold 55,000 copies in its first month, and that's even after getting all of the critical acclaim in reviews. Since the game's release though, it's gone on to receive a cult following, and complete in the box copies of the game continue to rocket in price on resale websites like eBay. Combine this with the Xbox remaster being heavily censored, it makes the Nintendo 64 experience the definitive one to play. The game's packed with unique gameplay, absolutely bonkers characters which have a lot of humour and interesting set pieces within it, although now some of the jokes are very dated and in this day and age would never see the light of day. But that's what makes this game what it is. It's a pure product of its time, and in a world that's gone, well, PC crazy, it's refreshing to play a game where clearly the devs gave 0 Fs when making it. In short, this is one Nintendo 64 game that everybody needs to play through their lifetime. I feel this one rightly deserves its place in the top 10 list of anyone's Nintendo 64 games, but I personally would have had this higher up than the 9th spot. But this is Metacritic's list, and when you see what's up next, you'll really start thinking WTF. Wave Race 64, the 8th best Nintendo 64 game on the console. Surely this isn't right, but according to Metacritic, it is. With a score of 92, it's right up there with some games which are remembered as all-time classics. I absolutely love Wave Race 64. The water physics for the time were out of this world, and the gameplay was just so much fun to play. Whilst the amount of tracks was limited, and sure in this day and age some of the textures look rough around the edges, it's easy to forget though that on its release just how impressive this game was to look at. More importantly though, it could be backed up with very tight gameplay, just enough challenge to keep you coming back on the harder difficulties, and a few nice secrets like being able to ride a dolphin to keep even the most dedicated racing game fan coming back. Released across 1996 and 1997 depending on where in the world you live, Wave Race 64 is a jet ski racing game developed and published by Nintendo as their first racing game on Nintendo 64 and as a direct follow-up to the 1992 Game Boy title Wave Race. Originally planned to have high-powered water boats in the vein of maybe Hydro Thunder, the plan was to have the boats transform as you raced. But this plan was eventually scrapped to go on a more pure jet ski racing experience, with the focus being put on the unique water physics to make each race feel unique and to add a challenge to the player having to adapt to the ever-changing water. The physics were so impressive for the time that Codemasters even cited the game as an inspiration for the Colin McRae Rally series for a game which combined great physics with tight control, which was something they really wanted for their simulation rally experience. Wave Race 64 was a huge commercial success for Nintendo, selling over 1 million copies in the US alone within its first 12 months of release. It was one of the first Nintendo 64 games which I picked up from my local game store after I got the console that Christmas, and I don't think I traded it in for months because of just how much fun and joy I got from the game. The problem for me, however, is that whilst the game is phenomenally good, there's just so many better titles that don't make this Metacritic top 10 list that for me it shouldn't be here. This again is a game which I think every gamer should play to completion at once in their lifetime, but for me it's not a top 10 game on the console. BanjoKazooie was Rare's big title of 1998, and with a huge amount of hype prior to its release, it was finally a real contender to become the console's best platform game and dethrone Super Mario 64. Developed and published by Rare, BanjoKazooie is a game which I think universally everyone would agree deserves a place in a top 10 Nintendo 64 game of all time list. The Metacritic score is 92, and when it comes to single player games on the console, this one's a must play. With the unique bird and bear combo, you play as Banjo and Kazooie as you venture into Spiral Mountain to try and stop the evil witch Gruntilda from stealing Banjo's sister's beauty. It's a silly storyline, but that's a good thing because the game comes across like one of those fun Saturday morning cartoons as you venture into different lands, meet quirky characters and learn new moves which help you explore and traverse the ever-growing game world. This game received universal acclaim for the visuals, the unique concepts and the length of the game, which could take you over 40 hours on your first playthrough. It spawned a series of sequels after this game, and as a first entry into the series it pretty much set the bar which arguably has never been surpassed even by the game's later entries into the series. The game did much better than expected in Japan, where it sold over 100,000 copies, and in the West it did even better than Rare were predicting, which led them to earn a gold prize at the 1998 Melia Festival in Cannes for European revenues over €26 million. The music is one of the more memorable aspects of the game for me, which is absolutely sublime, and it was all created by industry legend Grant Kirkhope, which also won a number of awards. When it comes to the most decorated Nintendo 64 games of all time, BanjoKazooie is right up there in terms of awards, and so it's somewhat surprising to only see this game make the 7th spot on Metacritic's Nintendo 64 Best Games list, but once again it is an epic title that you just need to play. With versions available on Xbox now, it's a game which should be easy for anyone to pick up and play cheaply. And if you have an Xbox Ultimate Reward subscription, then you can play many of Rare's titles from Nintendo 64 on Rare Replay free of charge. They've also just added 4K support, and so if you want a slightly enhanced version with better analog control, then that's perhaps the version to find if you want to play it. But if you're an old school fool like me, then well, the cart version on Nintendo 64 is still fairly cheap and easy to find. Paper Mario is simply put the best RPG on Nintendo 64. Now that's not exactly saying much, considering that one of the most criticised aspects of the console was its inability to compete and really go head to head with the PlayStation, where RPG games came with epic scales that the cart-based format of N64 simply couldn't compete with. But being Nintendo, they weren't going to let fans down, and in the year 2000 we received Paper Mario, developed by Intelligent Systems and published by Nintendo, to act as a spiritual sequel to Super Mario RPG from the previous console generation. As you'd expect with a Mario-based title from the time, the story sees Princess kidnapped by Bowser, and he's also imprisoned 7 Spirit Stars and also obtained the Star Rod which makes him invincible. The original plan was that Nintendo had the game lined up for Square to create. However, as they were deep working on Final Fantasy VII, the game was handed over to Intelligent Systems, who worked on the game for a number of years. The game was to spawn many sequels in the Paper Mario series, and this initial entry in the series was so well received that it made Nintendo Power's Top 200 Games list in 2006, earning the 63rd spot. Selling nearly 300,000 copies in Japan in its first few weeks of release shows just how much pent-up demand there was in Japan for a role-playing game on Nintendo 64, and sales were consistently good across all worldwide regions. I just wish that the game had come out earlier in the console's life, because at this later part of the console's lifespan there wasn't sufficient time to get a follow-up out in time before the GameCube was launched. Saying that though, when it comes to RPGs, I think this is such a fantastic game. For anyone new to the genre, there's just enough hand-holding here in the early stages to get you hooked, and yet for RPG veterans, there's enough depth here with the battle system and cool, unexpected moments in the storyline that they just don't feel like they're playing a dumbed-down RPG for noobs. RPG games these days are really not my genre, as I don't have time to be able to commit to the huge amount of hours that they often require. But back in the day I remember being hooked on this game for so long, and it's one of the most satisfying games to complete on the N64 in my opinion. This game 100% deserves its place in a top 10 Nintendo 64 games list. For me though, it would be lower down, but that's more to do with what kind of games I prefer. With Metacritic's score of 93, this game's just pure gold. In this day and age, has anyone not played Super Mario 64? Let's not beat around the bush here. On its release, Super Mario 64 was quite simply one of the greatest works of video game development in history. With a Metacritic score of 94 and lifetime sales which run into the multi-millions, it's a game which was worth every one of the 3 years it took to create. If Super Mario Bros. Was the benchmark for 2D platform games, then Super Mario 64 was a benchmark for all future 3D platform games. Even years into the N64's life cycle, anytime a 3D platform game would be shown to the press, it would be instantly compared to Super Mario 64. Although some people started to get tired with the comparisons, it happened for a reason, and that's because Super Mario 64 was just that good. It's rare for a launch title to finish as one of the console's top selling games of all time, but lo and behold, here we are. It's a game which introduced most players into the world of fully 3D games, open world levels which you were free to explore, and most importantly analog controls, which admittedly did take some getting used to, but with how well the controls and camera system worked in Super Mario 64, it set the standard for years to come. Sadly, we never did get the Super Mario 64 direct follow-up on the N64, which I would have loved to have experienced. But the fact that the innovations of this game helped to improve the entire gaming industry is nothing less than groundbreaking, and so you won't find a top 10 N64 games list anywhere that won't feature this title on it. It wouldn't be a Nintendo 64 list without a Zelda title being on it, and landing on 4th spot was Majora's Mask, the console's follow-up to Ocarina of Time, a game which is almost the weird cousin of the franchise. With a Metacritic score of 95, Majora's Mask landed on store shelves from Nintendo in the year 2000, and many people who picked up the title were surprised by the darker tone which the game was set. In the same way how Temple of Doom was much darker than Raiders, Majora's Mask seemed a lot more depressing and serious in tone than its predecessor. The game takes place 2 months after Ocarina of Time, and it took 2 years of development to complete and get released by Nintendo. But what makes Majora's Mask so interesting is that although it received reviews very similar to Ocarina of Time, it only sold about half as many copies, despite having so many unique aspects to it. Not to mention the 3-day time cycle in the game, which is why this game feels more like a game with a cult following than a commercial successful one. Needless to say though, it really does deserve to be on anyone's playlist. And whilst Ocarina of Time impressed with its storyline, grand scale, and bringing Zelda into 3D, Majora's Mask focuses instead on game mechanics and atmosphere. Whilst many compare the games side by side, I really don't think that's how best to view these two titles. They need to both be played, but with different expectations, and rather than Majora's Mask feeling like a quick cash-in on the success of OOT, it feels like genuine care went into wanting to make something truly unique here. Now I'd love to know why you think this game sold much less than Ocarina of Time. My theory is that as it required the expansion pack, this instantly reduced the possible sales base of the game. Although from my own experience, I think that most people in the year 2000 would have already had the expansion pack. But what other reasons do you think? Let me know down below. Goldeneye 007 revolutionised console first-person shooters, and not only that, but it became the benchmark of licensed video games and showed the world that a licensed video game could be more than a quick cash grab, especially if it's based on a popular IP. Another rare entry into the series sees Goldeneye 007 get a smashing 96 Metacritic score, and as an all-round experience it's simply one of the console's best titles. As a single player experience you have a huge amount of levels with some cool concepts and level design which follows the plot of the movie, but not at the detriment of creating an enjoyable game. As a multiplayer experience however, this is where most people will remember the game, and I can't even count just how many hours I would have spent on deathmatches in my lifetime. If you had a Nintendo 64 back in the day, you also had Goldeneye, it was that simple. Gaming after school with friends, you'd play Goldeneye. Sleep over at someone's house, you'd play Goldeneye. Family night in on the console, you'd play Goldeneye. Your girlfriend dumped you and started dating Steve, who had a flashy car, a bank account, and tons of drip. Well, you'd sit in bed crying all day, and then you'd probably play Goldeneye. Whilst in this day and age the game does look dated and many people believe it doesn't hold up, I still think it does. And the fact that you can still pick up and play this title after all these years and instantly feel right at home shows just what an impact it had on many people of my era in gaming. Many people feel that this is the best FPS game on Nintendo 64 until our next entry in this list showed up. Perfect Dark was the Goldeneye 007 follow-up that everyone wanted and yet often have a lesser memory of. It can be argued that because Goldeneye was an earlier N64 title and many people had fonder memories of it, that it's more widely remembered. But when it comes to improvements, Perfect Dark pretty much wipes the floor with Goldeneye. Delivering a 97 Metacritic score and being a must-play title, Perfect Dark was published and developed by Rare and showed once again why the company was integral to the success of the N64 as a whole. Taking the best elements of Goldeneye, adding a cool sci-fi story, some insane weapons and visuals that pushed the console to its limits, was Perfect Dark in the year 2000. It's fair to say that the hype for this title was off the charts. I remember when it was first announced that Rare weren't licensing The World Is Not Enough, and instead they wanted to create their own unique IP for their next project, and that many fans were disappointed that Rare wouldn't be providing the next Bond outing on the console. But this freedom allowed the team at Rare to create a whole world of cool plot twists, more three-dimensional characters, and come up with some awesome level design that the Bond franchise simply wouldn't have allowed. Perhaps the only criticism anyone had about the game was its frame rate, which at times can get a little too choppy, but as an overall experience the game is a masterpiece. The AI was greatly improved over Goldeneye, and it felt that enemies were responding in ways which hadn't been seen on any console at the time. Although the single player campaign is still a must play, multiplayer is perhaps why so many people wanted the game. After years on Goldeneye, I feel that a lot of people wanted more gameplay options in multiplayer, which, PC games had seen for a while now. So Perfect Dark delivers, and as an FPS game go on the console, it's the most complete package. Now sure, purists will always want Goldeneye, but that's most likely due to the nostalgia itch, but in terms of technical production, Perfect Dark is a much more rounded multiplayer offering. For me though, Perfect Dark isn't the second best Nintendo 64 game of all time. Metacritic of course disagrees with this is why the game's in the number 2 spot, but that's fine. And nostalgia is a powerful thing for me, so Goldeneye would always be above Perfect Dark. To the absolute surprise of nobody, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time hits the number 1 spot with a Metacritic score of 99 out of a possible 100. It's perhaps the only game on this list that I would 100% agree with the score, and if you see any N64 list that this game isn't top of, then you're probably not looking in the right places. Even to this day, as you'll all know by now, the game is my favourite game of all time. I doubt but I'll be surprised if I do find a game that I prefer more to this one day. After what felt like a millennia of hype, screenshots in magazines, delay after delay, and having an itch so big that it couldn't be scratched, Ocarina of Time was released and I can remember pretty much every moment of playing it. I did a 40-minute retrospective of the game where for the first half an hour I was pretty much waxing lyrical about what an impact this game had both in terms of gaming industry as a whole and my own personal perspective of it. So I won't bore you with that again, but let's say in 1998, if you had a Nintendo 64, you'd been waiting and waiting and waiting for this game. As the first Zelda game with 3D graphics, there was a lot of pressure on Nintendo to make this a hit. In the same way that the pressure was on Mario 64 to bring Mario into 3D with a masterpiece, the same pressure was on Nintendo to do the same with one of their most cherished franchises. The delays were worth it, and where the PlayStation had Final Fantasy VII as its masterpiece, so the Nintendo 64 has this game. Editors at Game Trailers called the game a walking patent office, given just how many features the game introduced, which have gone on to become industry standard for this genre of game. The only criticisms of this game seem to be around its audio department, which when compared to the CD-based PlayStation did leave a lot to be desired, both in terms of sample rate and quality. But it didn't stop the game selling like crazy, even selling more in its first few weeks of release than Metal Gear Solid had achieved on the PlayStation in Japan, and that too had been a monster hit. If you play this on Nintendo 64, the GameCube Special Edition disc that came with pre-orders of Wind Waker, or even the more modern 3DS version which I also love, you quite simply need to play this game at some point in your lifetime, especially if you haven't already done so. And so there you have it, the top 10 Metacritic Nintendo 64 games, and so for today's topic of conversation I'd love to know what your top 10s would look like. Which games on this list would you swap out, and which games would you put back in their place? If there's anyone watching who wouldn't have Ocarina of Time as a number 1 pick, I'd also love to hear what is your number 1 pick for the console too. As always, let me know your thoughts and feelings, comments and opinions in the comment section down below, and until next time.